All right. Thank you, everyone, to coming to this event on the status of Hindi language in both Hindi and in Australia. I am Ian Woolford. I am a lecturer in Hindi language at Trobe University. So I'm not. It's not being exaggerating at all to say this is a really exciting day for me because I'm sharing the stage with two sort of heroes of mine. Aditi Maheshwari is Director of Copyright and Translations at Varni Prakashan in New Delhi. This is one of the largest Hindi publishers out there, and throughout its history has published the greats, the giants of Hindi literature. So it's just very exciting for me to have her here and to talk to her about publishing and about Hindi and about what she sees as the future of all these things. And then I'm really excited also to be joined by Mrinal Pande, who is she is a journalist. She is a writer. Yes, I said you were a fighter. It's absolutely amazing to have her here, partly because I've been reading her work for so long. I've assigned some of her Hindi writing to my students to read, so it's just sort of fantastic to have her here. And I really would like to just thank the Australia-India Institute for supporting a function like this. Craig Jeffrey, who couldn't make it here now, but he basically said whoever I want to invite, he just let me do that. And La Trobe Asia at my university has also supported this event and given a lot of resources for this. So thank you both for coming. I know it's been a very long journey for you, and I wonder if I could start. The topic, ostensibly the topic is Hindi in Australia. There is a mystery chair right now which may be joined by someone or not, we'll see. But obviously the two of you are not from Australia, and neither am I. I've been here for 4 years from the United States. But very much the story of Hindi in Australia obviously cannot be separated from the story of Hindi in India. So I think it's definitely worth our time to talk a bit about that. And our format we'll be chatting for about 30 minutes. And then I'd really like to hear what questions you all have. So we'll leave at least half of the time for that. And I wonder, though, if I could start just by reading this poem by Sri Kedarnath Singh, who writes, he's another one of my heroes, and he writes so well on language and how language relates to identity, and on the multilingual situation in India, when he writes in his poem, Desh aur Ghar, country and the home. Or nation and the home, or really world and the home. He sets up a distinction between the world and the home. And he says, Hindi mera desh hai, Bhojpuri mera ghar. Hindi is my world, Hindi is my nation, but Bhojpuri is my home. Ghar se nikalta hun to chala jata hun desh mein. Desh se chutti milti hai to laut aata hun ghar. So whenever I leave my home, I enter the world. And whenever I take leave of the world, I re-enter the home. And remember, he's talking about the world and the home. He's talking about Hindi and Bhojpuri, his mother tongue, the language of his village, the language of his parents. Is awa jahi main, in this back and forth. I'm going back and forth between Hindi and Bhojpuri, between the world and the home. To is awa jahi main, kai baar ghar se chala aata hai desh, desh mein kai baar chut jata hai ghar. So sometimes I leave a piece of my home in the world, in the country, and sometimes I leave a piece of the country, of the world in my home. तो मैं दोनों को प्यार करता हूँ. I love them both. मैं दोनों को प्यार करता हूँ. और देखिए न मेरी मुश्किल. Look at this difficulty that I have. कि पिछले 60 बरसों से दोनों मैं दोनों को खोज रहा हूँ. For the past 70 years, I've been searching for one within the other. And I think when we talk about India's multilingual situation, and we can also talk about Australia's multilingual situation, I think it's just worth asking a basic question, sort of following on from a poem like this, talking about, he doesn't describe a struggle, he describes almost a very loving relationship. But in India, it seems that multilingualism is often treated as almost like a problem. So I was wondering, just following on from this, what your general thoughts are on this. What is the status of Hindi in India right now, perhaps from the perspective of a poem like this, Mrinalji?
Well, Hindi, as you've made it clear, is something which is divided between an inside and an outside. But there is also not one Hindi. For me, there are 3 outsides or 4 outsides, because I come from the hills near Tibet, in my mother tongue was a dialect which is spoken locally, but which is written in the same script as Hindi. And the grammatic structure of that language is more or less the same as Hindi. So I grew up speaking that at home, but when I went to school, I learnt Hindi. And in school, till class 5, we were communicating entirely in Hindi. So we came home and switched to Kumauni, and when we went to school, we switched to Hindi. Class 5 onwards, English entered the classroom. And so we were expected to communicate with our teachers in the Hindi classes in Hindi and in the English language classes, which also covered social sciences, in English. Maths posed a particular problem because I had learnt my initial math in Hindi. And I could multiply like the Chinese multiply, ek ekam ek, do ekam do, teen ekam teen. So it was taught, math was taught to us like a poem. Do ekam do, do duni char, do tiyan chhe, do chakke aat, do panje das, do chakke 12. So you still mentally computed in Hindi. But then you had to switch to English. So that was, but as a child you learn to cope with things. And then you go to the university and you meet this terribly Edwardian English prose in which classes are taught in Indian universities. And then you start working and you meet another variety of English which is terribly bureaucratic and clerically communicated. So that's another variety. And then I started by teaching English literature and language. And then finally, I came across students of engineering who had, like me, grown up in the learning in the Hindi medium. And all of a sudden, and they, by the time their generation grew up, all communication in government schools for political reasons had to be done in Hindi, in the Hindi belt. So these kids had no English whatsoever, but they were very bright, so they cracked the exam to make it into an engineering college. And they could not understand a thing that was being taught in the classes, though they knew their physics, chemistry, math, but in Hindi. So it was a very strange kind of a situation. And here their parents had enormous expectations. They themselves had enormous expectations. And the government still kept on harping on Hindi in government schools, primarily to placate the voters and tell them, look, we respect your mother tongue much more than we respect any other tongue in India. So on the one hand, it created this peculiar situation in the government school system. And down south, it created an enormous resentment against Hindi, also in West Bengal. So I grew up, with many friends and many enemies on many fronts. So the friends in my English class became enemies in my Hindi class. And friends in my school days, from my school days, who had continued with the Hindi medium became enemies when I met them elsewhere. And it was enriching, but also completely confusing and also very saddening. So I would say that eventually after 6 years of teaching at the university, 3 very prestigious universities in India, at Allahabad, in Bhopal, and in New Delhi, I decided to quit teaching English because it felt very strange and it was a very disorienting experience. So I switched to Hindi journalism. And I took to it like a duck to water because this Hindi was the Hindi that I had grown up speaking and listening all around me. It was spoken in many registers. And I also realized that there was a breed of journalists who were upwardly mobile, who were earning their living through Hindi because they did not know English, but their eventual destination was to become sufficiently well versed in English so that they could move to English language journalism, which was more paying and which had a greater profile. Never mind, it catered only to 7% of the readers, and never mind that Hindi catered to the rest of the readers. But so even within the system of journalism, there were many registers, many animosities and unexpressed feelings. So it's frankly a very, very confusing scene. But at the same time, the growth of Hindi has been phenomenal, partly because its footprint covers the 11 most populous states in India today. So it caters to 47% of the total literate population and 65% of the illiterate and literate population through the television. So Hindi is inescapable. A lot of people dislike it heartily. In the South, they routinely blacken Hindi billboards for understandable reasons. And there are actual wars fought during election on the linguistic planes. But the fact is that through Bollywood, through the demographic footprint, and through popular television soaps and news programs, Hindi has become entrenched. So there is no way, if you are in the communication business, you can escape Hindi. So one may as well make peace with it and try and understand the various types of Hindi there are. So I now tell my English language friends, get lost. If you cannot understand these complexities, just get lost. There's no future for you. I've said it to ministers who said that they would not speak in Hindi because they came from Tamil Nadu. So I said, then you will never be the Prime Minister of the country. And now Mr. P. Chidambaram, one of the strongest leaders from Tamil Nadu, has himself confessed that India can never be led by a leader who cannot speak Hindi. But I'm not saying this, I'm not making a boast, because Hindi has much to answer for. It's also a terrible, terrible bully in various fields. And it has rubbed many people the wrong way. You read a poem by Kedarnath Singh. There is another poem by Raghuveer Sahai, who compares Hindi to the second wife of a fat, rich man who's a very suspicious husband. So every morning he leaves home and locks her in. And this woman sleeps, reads cheap magazines all day long, eats a lot, gets fat, and quietly sends all the precious stuff from this house to her maternal home, to her mother and her brothers. So he pictures Hindi like the fat, listless, terribly bored, sexually deprived wife of a rich, fat, and very, very suspicious husband. So that, in a way,
good night,
is the
everyone. I thought you said so many fascinating things, Mrinal. Before I sort of throw some of this over to Aditi, since Kumud Merani, Executive Director of SBS Hindi, just arrived, why don't you come up on stage as well? But first, maybe go back to Cog right there just to get a mic so people be able to hear you. You've got a mic. Come on up then. Welcome. I think you just came from recording for the program, which is why you probably got.
I was waiting for you, actually.
I was looking for you. Wonderful. Well, I'm
sorry, everyone. Just a bit late, but delighted to be here.
The reason I said you probably were recording a program is that sounded much better, as we just couldn't find each other. So I was hoping you would pick up on that and say yes.
It's been a busy time for Ian. He's been a great host.
So look, I started off, and I think it's fascinating that you're talking about these tensions, and you use the word Hindi being inescapable, and you also talked about the way it forges friendships, and then you switched and said it causes wars, and then you ended with Raghuveer Sahai's amazing poem, which I think is fascinating. But the thread throughout of it for me was it was rooted in your own personal experience, and that was sort of fascinating to me. And I'm just wondering, Aditi, if you would have a similar narrative about your relationship with Hindi or with Hindi and English, and how would you describe this?
It's a narrative with various ebbs and highs. My father recalls the times when he and my grandfather went to Chennai, Hyderabad, Warangal, Telangana area, and he would ride on my grandfather's shoulders and would peacefully pull down the placards which said Hindi bhagao, Hindi hatao in early 60s or early 70s. So he recalls that as his foundation. And the reason Vani Prakashan was started was because my grandfather was a writer for children, and he published with a very reputed publishing house who never paid the royalties. So he thought, okay, he and his friends came together with small amount of money and they started their publishing house. So starting from there, Hindi prem, Hindi becoming the part of the family, the movement around which everything happens, in fact even the financial activities in a family, the way they earn their bread and butter through a certain language. So I'm going to talk from that perspective. For me, it's a source of income, it's a source of living, it's a source of feeding 128 people who work at Vani Prakashan spread across 8 cities. And for us, it is definitely a very pragmatic decision to be in this ecosystem of languages more than emotional. The reason I say this because when the generations are changing, the scenarios around you change a bit too much. I got educated all through in English medium schools, and then I went ahead to do my bachelor's and master's in English literature, and then did another master's in public relation and advertising, that was again in English. Then did my MPhil in social sciences, that was again in English, and then did my MBA again in English. So for me to come back to manage a publishing house that majorly operates in Hindi it took a lot, I think it took a lot of responsibility, because initially for 2-3 years I was petrified to speak publicly, because I thought that my Hindi was very functional and I was not qualified enough to address a public gathering in a very impeccable, decent Hindi. But when I started reading from the scratch, I think I schooled myself with the kind of basics that we all read about in encyclopedias, in anthologies of Hindi literature in English. So I'm very sorry to say, with all due apologies, I started from there. So I had to go back to Rag Darbari, I had to go back to all the greats, despite the fact that whether they were published by Vani or not. But the idea was to cover up on a lot of readings that probably my parents or my grandparents did all through their schooling, college and everything. Now, आज भी सीख रही हूँ, और सार्वजनिक संबोधन अभी भी मुझे लगता है कि मुझे बहुत ट्रेनिंग करनी पड़ती है, बहुत तैयारी के साथ जाती हूँ. लेकिन जब हम when we are talking about managing a business in a certain language, I do feel that India today is aspiring in English, but it always dreams in their own mother tongue, and Hindi is one of the largest, language that is considered as mother tongue by a lot of people. Again, the idea of bullying, yes, when I go to, for example, Patna Book Fair, when I go to Darbhanga Book Fair, when I go to Lucknow Book Fair, I come across writers who say that आपके यहाँ तो अवधी के लिए जगह ही नहीं है, आपके यहाँ तो भोजपुरी के लिए जगह ही नहीं, हमने भोजपुरी में उपन्यास लिखा है, आप क्यों नहीं छापती हैं. So then I really feel petrified, because I don't know how to sell those books. Even though the script is Devanagari, but the narratives in Bhojpuri, Awadhi, I just don't know how to develop those markets. As far as creating market or being in the Hindi market is concerned, from the perspective of a publishing house, none of the statistics, none of the online book sales, none of the commercial systems are operating in Hindi in India. If you are talking about Amazon, you talk about Flipkart, you talk about ebooks creation, you talk about all kinds of book scans that are happening. In fact, Nielsen just entered Hindi through Dainik Jagran, and the way they are trying to create a data of Hindi literature in various formats, none of it is being computed in Hindi. So we have to face this reality that it's a dichotomous world. We have to identify our our intellectual property, make it monetizable, make it talk to the world through translations, and that's what my portfolio is about.
Thank you. It's very interesting to me how, even though you're talking about this from a very practical perspective or the business perspective, how some of these similar threads of your personal sort of emotional relationship to all these languages came out. So maybe we'll have time to talk about that a bit more. Kumudji, sort of the question is just a very basic one of how do you view, actually even your personal relationship with Hindi language, which you might have a different perspective through your work here in Australia through SBS Hindi Radio. So what do you see as your relationship with Hindi?
Okay, first of all, I'm here with Hindi scholars and Hindi writers, followers of Hindi, lovers of Hindi, and maybe the agnostic, but I feel like a bull in a china shop, I must say that. My education too, like Aditi said, has been in English, and I'm a Bombayite, call me Mumbaikar if you please, where Hindi is a bit corrupted. We speak a different type of Hindi. But I love languages, and I come from a family where my father was interested in languages, and he insisted every night we read one story in English and one in Hindi. He used to read to me, and later on I had to read on my own, and that developed my interest in Hindi. Going on to my profession, I used to read the news on Doordarshan in Mumbai, and there our Hindi was very pure. It was a purist's Hindi. So I had to follow instructions. I read the script that was given to me, and people and other friends said, look, we wait for the English translation in the 9 o'clock news, because they didn't follow that news. So taking it from there, when I arrived in Australia, I read the English news on SBS World News on TV. Following that, I went on to the Hindi program, which I'm currently heading, and I enjoy very much. I've been there for 30 years. Talking about Hindi from the perspective of Australia, having been here for more than 30 years, I'll give you all a few statistics. I won't make it boring, I promise you that. Hindi in Australia today is the 8th most spoken language. In the world, globally, it is the 2nd according to some research, and according to other research, it is the 3rd most spoken language in the world. Hence, the importance of Hindi is increasing. It's a global language today. We can't say it's a language that is restricted to India, because we have a huge migrant population, and also, of course, Hindi is spoken in Fiji, Suriname, Nepal, so many other countries, East Africa. And as I said, over here now, we have 160,000 people in Australia who call Hindi their mother tongue. But apart from that 160,000, which does not include me, because my mother tongue is not Hindi, it is Sindhi. There'll be people who speak Marathi, people who speak Punjabi, Gujarati, etc. And there's roughly just under 500,000 Indians in Australia, and 75% of them speak or understand Hindi to varying levels. And therefore, the importance of Hindi rises, and the relations of Australia and India have increased manifold. They go beyond trade, industry, and commerce. It's now education, culture, people's exchange, people-to-people contact, and I'm so glad. Finally, we've given up the 3 C's of cricket, Commonwealth, and curry, and I think we've got to adopt the 3 E's of education, entrepreneurship, and economics. Okay, and by the by, I'm glad that the idea of a very high IELTS, 6-level IELTS, that's International English Language Test Scheme, has been struck down momentarily. I'm not against English, as I said. We've studied in English throughout. English is important. It is global. We've got to speak English wherever we are in the world. But that does not diminish the importance of Hindi. Hindi, I think, is now very necessary with the growing relationship between the two countries, certainly for students, for diplomats, bureaucrats, to know at least a smattering of Hindi. Talking of the media perspective, let's have a wide look at the mainstream media. Do they really mention the Indian diaspora here? Not really. If it's something to do with the Adani mines, yes, it's there. If it's something to do with a fraudulent college or some kind of petty crime, it's there. But what about the trials, the tribulations, the achievements, the triumphs, the troughs and the downfalls of this community? Its particular issues, the solutions to those issues. And that comes through the Hindi media, and Hindi is taught in 152 universities around the world. You'll be glad to know that. I wish more universities in Australia also taught Hindi. It is certainly being taught at schools. More and more schools are trying very hard to imbibe it. We need to cultivate within the parents the idea of developing Hindi and encouraging their children to learn Hindi as well. It's an asset. The more languages you learn, the easier other languages become for you. So why the importance of Hindi? It's flexible, it's adopting, it's adaptive. The Hindi language itself has incorporated words from 48 different languages. And Aditi, you were just saying about Uriya and Bhojpuri and several other regional languages. They are all being incorporated to some extent into Hindi. So within Hindi, we have several other Hindis. And Hindi, of course, has been popularized by the largest film industry in the world. Our Prime Minister Modi speaks in Hindi, be it at the UN or be it in Myanmar or be it even in Australia, and people applaud. So they are understanding Hindi to some extent, and it would be great if they could speak a little more Hindi. Now, from the media point of view, I mentioned it yesterday as well at a conference, that it's the spoken word. We say it once, you hear it once, and it's gone, and the next sentence rolls in. We are in the business of communication. And in Australia, we are communicating, say for example, from SBS Hindi, we are communicating not just with the Hindi speaker, but we are speaking to the Pakistani who also understands Hindi. We are speaking to the person from Nepal. The Bangladeshi also understands Hindi to some extent. Hence, we try to make it something that's easy to the ears, a language of communication. And so Hindustani is widely accepted. Hindi can be the purest Hindi, the Pandits Hindi, the spiritualists Hindi, the Hindi of the literati, or the Hindi of the slightly lesser educated person. But even the lesser educated person, the simplest person on the street in India is speaking a smattering of English as well. If I take a rickshaw in Bombay, the rickshaw driver says, madam, no, not madam, I'm auntie now, I'm qualified as auntie. Auntie, signal pe rokega? He means signal pe rokega. So in the same way, Hindi too has adopted so many words of English which we don't even realize. Cup, bottle, table par rakha hai, pen, paper, station, train. So we have kept adopting these words, and that enriches a language. A language that remains stagnant cannot grow further. It cannot be adopted by people. And that's what happened with the beautiful language of Sanskrit. Devvani it was called, the language of the gods. But it was the language of the purest, the priestly class, the higher, upper class. Women didn't even learn Sanskrit. So it stopped at a certain stage. Hindi is flowing on, and I would say we should all adopt it. और हिंदी के झोंके में आप सब आइए तो बड़ा अच्छा रहेगा. Hindi itself, again, if we look at films, we have different types of Hindis depending on the era. I don't know how many Indians, we have a lot of Indians here. Permit me to just refer to some movies. Say, for example, it depends on the era and the character, the Hindi, right? So in 1935, we had the film Devdas by Pramathesh Barua. In that, Devdas says, मेरे वालदाइन मेरे खिलाफ है, मैं उनकी हुक्म हुजूरी करूं, तो फिर तुम कहाँ रहोगी पारो? तो पारो कहती है, तुम्हारे चरणों में. 1955, Devdas again by Bimal Roy. Now Devdas his language changes, the era changes. मेरे माँ बाप इससे बिल्कुल सहमत नहीं हैं. अगर उनकी मर्ज़ी के ख़िलाफ़ तुमसे शादी करूँगा तो तुम कहाँ रहोगी पारो. तो वो वही कहते हैं कि आपके चरणों में. So by now आपके चरणों में has become idiomatic. Or now look at Mughal-e-Azam 1960 by K. Asif, where Akbar says to Salim, हम अपने बेटे के धड़कते दिल के लिए हिंदुस्तान की तकदीर नहीं बदल सकते. सलीम से तकदीरें बदल जाती हैं, ज़माना बदल जाता है, मुल्कों की तारीख़ें बदल जाती हैं, शहंशाह बदल जाते हैं, मगर इस बदलती दुनिया में मोहब्बत जिस इंसान का दामन बदल देती है वो इंसान नहीं बदलता. और हिंदी जो है वो बदलती जाती है. हिंदी को अपनाइए, हिंदी को सराइए, हिंदी बोलिए.
There you go. Well, thank you very much, Kumud, for that. One thing you made me think of, you brought up some points that both Aditi and Mrinalji had spoken of. You mentioned this idea of multiple Hindis, or Hindis containing all these other sort of Hindis, and I think this is something we don't have time now, but we could talk about quite a bit. But I think Raghuveer Sahai would possibly disagree, or maybe you would even disagree, because you both described it in terms of a real tension, Bombaya Hindi versus Hindi, which some linguists would say are actually different languages, and Hindi is sort of stamping them out, or Awadhi, or Bhojpuri, or your mother tongue, your mother's mother tongue. So I think there's a real point of contention here, but you also made me think my eyes on the time, I know we need to get to our question and answer session, but you were just making me think of the politics of all of this, the politics of language, or we were talking about journalism and all this, and some of the difficulties there. And I was just thinking, hearing you, Kumudji, when we talk about Hindi as a national language or not, whether or not it is, and Hindi being imposed or not, this is an idea we brought up. And it just occurred to me this sort of almost an irony, or that on the one hand we think of Hindi is being imposed, and we get some people on the left, even if we want to call it that, who associate Hindi with Hindu nationalism. This actually something seems to happen, and yet when we talk about the writers' protests that have happened, when we talk about what's happening in regional journalism, it seems that some of the very things that are labeled anti-national are happening in Hindi. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that from the perspective of journalism even. How does Hindi play into this? It's both this thing from the top that's stamping out all this regionalism, and yet it's this thing that's being labeled as anti-national, this word azadi that's being labeled an anti-national word is a Hindi word. So how do we resolve this tension?
Azadi is not from the Hindi
No,
origin,
of course
it's from
not.
Persian.
Thank you.
Anyway, actually Hindi today, I'll only talk from today's perspective,
Yes.
because we can't go too far back in the history. Hindi today is a heavily politicized language, and that creates a problem for people like me, who have come out of 3 generations of writers who wrote in Hindi in varying registers. You love the Hindi of great writers, but you hate the Hindi which communicates to you a refeudalization of the democratic space for discourse in India today. So the phenomena of Modi, who's dubbed a rock star, grew on the back of Hindi. He came like a shooting star riding Hindi. And for years, I've been in journalism for almost 4 decades. And for years, I had been warning political parties who were becoming successful political parties, including the Congress and the left-wing parties. They were becoming more and more Anglo-centric because they were powerful parties. They liaised with the powerful forces all the world over and the corporates. And in India, it is a social dividing line. People who know English and people who do not know English. People who know English, you can be sure, come from a fairly advantaged background. They've been to English medium schools or schools which taught English very well, have taken private tuitions even, whose families are in the middle classes, who have never lacked for their daily bread. And if Hindi doesn't serve their purpose, they can always move to English and find themselves a good job. On the other hand, there are people who do not know any English. For them, Hindi may be the language of political discourse, but it does not give them anything. So the politicians sold them dreams. Somebody like Modi, who came flying on the back of this big flappy bird of Hindi, sold them dreams. And he told them he would put 15 lakhs, which is 1.5 million, in every Indian's account by bringing back all the black money that was deposited in foreign banks. Now, it was an impossibility, as any well-educated Indian would know. But 70% of the Indians with whom the 30% English-knowing corporates and economists did not communicate believed him, because we have a long history of avatars descending from the heaven when we were about to dissolve into chaos, and on one finger Krishna can lift a whole mountain and say, "Come with me, all ye poor people, all you cowherds." So here was this tea seller's son who came flap, 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 promised everybody 1.5 million, and also played up this game. You poor, voiceless people, look at Congress. They are prosperous people. Sonia Gandhi is from Rome. The Gandhi family has Christian origins. So-and-so is very rich. So-and-so is very rich. I am a poor tea seller's son. I will give you. I know exactly how poverty hurts. This was the first time after Gandhi that a leader was talking to people in a language which the masses understood. And the very fact that somebody spoke their language moved them so much that they gave him everything that they had. Even when Modi unleashed demonetization, made all the money in the country obsolete at midnight, like whose pumpkin? Anyway, and they forgave him, and you asked any common man on the street, and they would say, "But we trust Modi ji. Right. He has done it to bring back black money. He says black money will come back. Everybody who has black money, they will be burning pyres of it. And we trust him." So nothing happened. Such a huge step which nobody in the world, no world leader dares to take. He took because his bird began to flap and he began to lift the mountain on his little finger. And he said, "God has ordained me." But last week, he went to the Kedarnath temple, a very major Shiva temple up in the Himalayas. And he said, "It was for me. I was ordained by the Lord to rebuild this temple, which got destroyed in a flood 3 years ago. And I offered my services to the chief minister, but he was a congressman and he turned me down." Fact is that congressman is now in his party. Very soon after the disaster, he was thrown out of power. And now Modi immediately picked him up and took him in his party. So boundaries keep changing, but that's politics for you. You will say, it happens in every country. But the kind of magic, the surreal magic that one political leader with a grasp over the common popular idiom can create makes you wonder about both the power and the dangers of populist rhetoric. Believe me, it has nothing to do with economics. We remember that famous thing, it's the economy stupid. In India, it's Hindi stupid. You speak in Hindi to the common man and you tell him, I'm Krishna's avatar, I'm Shiva's avatar, my father sold tea, I sold tea and I grew up wearing a half knicker, and I'm going to give you everything that the evil congressmen and the lefties have denied you. And underneath, all kinds of other games happen. And so Hindi today is a loaded, it's like a firecracker that has yet to go off. You have to handle with extreme care, take care to see where it is lit. But at the same time, wonderful literature is being produced in Hindi. And Hindi newspapers are registering an almost 12% increase in defiance of all journalistic norms today in the world. Newspapers sell the most in some of the poorest states. I was the editor of a Hindi language newspaper. When I took over, it sold 64,000 copies in Delhi. When I retired 9 years later, it was selling 2.5 million copies in Delhi alone. It has 36 editions. We have rural sub-editions. We have small centers where 3 people operate the online pages and then send it to the next printing center and the next. The highest selling Hindi daily today has 52 editions in 17 states. So it's a very, very powerful medium. But as somebody who's stamped with Hindi, the moment you tell people you are a Hindi journalist, your market worth goes down. So if you call up for an appointment with a minister to interview somebody, his personal assistant comes to the phone and says, I'll give your message, and he may or may not call you back. But if you are an English language editor and you call, your call will immediately be put to the guy in charge. And so the English language editors and journalists have a standing quite disproportionate to the actual number of people whom they influence. And yet English dailies are referred to in India always as national dailies. And the rest of the languages are referred to as vernacular dailies or Indian language dailies. This has created a kind of a resentment which again the new leadership has cashed in on. You know, these English wallas, they are evil. They are the moneyed people. You know, he comes very close to the leftist rhetoric there in denouncing the rich and the powerful, saying that they have deliberately co-opted everything from you. They have deliberately taken everything away from you. I am a chaiwala's son. I understand your pain, and I'll give you a voice. But he has not held one single press conference so far. He has not given any interviews except to a few very, very friendly editors in television studios. And the editors were, almost orgasmically pleased at having the great man sitting and talking to them. So at the moment, I'm completely split about Hindi. I love the literature, and somehow or the other, in times of chaos, some really great literature gets created. When India was around 1857, when India was just splitting, we had people like Ghalib and Mir. We had poets like Ghalib and Mir. We had Bhartendu Harishchandra. We had Hali. Great poetry and great prose, because these are also moments of ironical disillusionment and a greater entering into the skin of the common fellow Indian, who you suddenly realize is a brother in pain. So today Hindi media has a great, brilliant future, but it is also somewhat frightening, because I don't see too many editors and too many strong guardians of Hindi media at the helm who will stand up to this political use of Hindi. Most of them have completely supplicated themselves, because the government is also the greatest provider of advertisements. Also, what has happened that in the last 5 years, there has been a huge consolidation of major media publications in the hands of corporate entities. And because of that, the government no longer talks even to the editors or to the bureau chiefs or to the city chiefs. They talk directly to the owner, and their wishes are carried out. But at the same time, Hindi media is still defying, and therefore the largest number of journalists killed are from Hindi and Indian regional language media. In fact, nearly every journalist killed in the last 10 years belong to the languages media, not to English. In English, if one journalist is thrown in the jail, all hell breaks loose, because they are PLUs. How can an English-speaking man be thrown in jail? But a Hindi-speaking or a Kannada writer can be killed in broad daylight, and people just burn candles and protest silently. So this is again a very interesting aspect, that it's the vernacular. When they returned the awards against a protest, to protest against the deaths and killings of journalists and writers in Indian languages, the movement was led mostly by Hindi language writers who are extremely poorly paid. Royalties are so few, and there will be a very rare writer who can live on his or her royalties alone. The reason I worked my fingers to the bone all through my life as a journalist was because I would have starved had I just lived on my literary output. So the regional languages have shown guts, even though they are underpaid, even though they are starved of many of the perks of power. They have shown more guts in standing up to the power. And at the moment, the power is somewhat worried about that phenomena. Because what is happening is that after demonetization, there have been several other things like crop failures and farmer suicides, which have got widely reported in language media and are now beginning to be reported also in the English language media. So that is worrisome, because the next elections are just round the corner in 2019, and these are going to be major issues. So how long can your bird flap its wings? Because the black money is not coming. You've done the Demonetization Act and not a penny came. In fact, the money that was returned to the banks was more than the money that they had computed. Yeah. So it was a great embarrassment, and the Reserve Bank governor was sacked. And another one took over, who wouldn't speak to the media for 2 months because he had nothing to say. So it's a very kind of a peculiar, very touchy scene in which language media was never as powerful and as vulnerable as it is today.
Thank you for that. You've described a very tragic situation, actually, because you discuss Hindi as, in terms of literature, as something you find solace in, as something we can all see our shared humanity. Yet you've also described this flapping bird metaphor, which is sort of stifling out other languages and also preying on people's hopes and fears. I wish we could talk about this more, but it's time to open up things to questions. Right. I would just remind everyone, though, if you have any questions about the very important topic that Mrinal ji just brought up of these journalists and writers that have been assassinated, that I know it's not an issue for this audience, but we have to remember for the people on the stage, they're not hashtags, they're our colleagues. M.M. Kalburgi was a professor in my own field. He's a colleague. Gauri Keish is someone we know very well. So it's something that we're not talking about from a distant perspective, and I know that's true for people in this room as well. We're talking about our friends and colleagues who've been assassinated in broad daylight. So it's a very difficult topic to talk about, but perhaps one that we should, especially since it does tie right into the theme of this evening. But what questions do you have for the panel that's here today? We'd love to hear them. Yes.
My name is Wendy. Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. I'm a bit out of touch with News on India. I was there early in the year when they had demonetisation, so that was good to get a follow-up with that. But 2 brief questions. One is, how many journalists have been assassinated in India in the past year? And the other question the lady from SBS, you were talking about Hindi being taught more in schools in Australia. I know with Mandarin that there are thousands of Australians studying Mandarin, but only 120 of them fluent Mandarin speakers in Australia are not from a Chinese background. So I'm just wondering, with the Hindi language, are Australian-born Australians studying it, or is it more the Indian migrants studying it in school? Thank you very much.
We can maybe take your first question first, which is, and I assume the reason you're asking because it sounds alarming and you're quite worried. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's been very upsetting.
It's something around 15, but this also includes people who wrote in Indian languages and called themselves rationalists. They were busting the religious and semi-religious myths that were being propagated in the name of religion to bring down and target smaller communities and minorities. So there were some rationalists. Then there were writers. Some of them were not killed, but the huge cases were slapped on them. Criminal cases were slapped on them. And for a writer, it's almost like death if your books are banned. There is a Tamil writer who was hounded so much by right-wing forces that he printed a newspaper bulletin saying he was not going to write henceforth. He was stopping writing because his book had been banned. So finally the writers got together and his writing was restored, but he's still under threat to his life. Then there was another young girl who was posted in the Maoist area. She wrote about the police atrocities against the so-called Maoists, who were not really Maoists but poor natives, who were being under pincer attack both from the Maoists and also from the police. And she had a criminal case against her. She was incarcerated, and after a lot of struggle, the journalistic community managed to get her out of the jail. And but her license to practice journalism was taken away, and she had to go out of the state because the state banished her from staying in the area, because they alleged that she was inciting the left-wing violent parties. So there have been multi-pronged attacks. I know many of my friends have had threats to them coming in various forms from various people associated or not associated with various parties. There have been cases where their families have received threats, their children have received threats. So it is a grim scene in that sense. There are journalists who pander to the government, who are very friendly with many eminent people, and they feel very secure perhaps, or relatively secure, and they can pick up the phone and call anybody and do whatever they like. But anyone who dares to voice some kind of, not even dissent, some kind of justified doubt about any of the questionable policies, particularly pertaining to minority communities, immediately receives attention. There are also stories about how political parties have created cells filled with trolls who regularly keep tabs on people who are questioning the government's decisions. So this is the first time in my 72 years of my life, this is the first time I remember the emergency days when Indira Gandhi brought in emergency. Even in those days, we used to be quite edgy, and it was a very difficult period. But it was, and social media being available to so many people at the same time, and its visibility being what it is, and technology being so user-friendly, things have become far more visible and far more threatening.
Just as we hand off the next question, I can very briefly answer because we're running short on time. I teach at the university level. Most of our students are non-Indian background Australian students who start from scratch. In the primary schools, there are programs that students can go to. There are quite a lot here in Victoria. Get a lot of students. Most of them are Indian background, and there are a handful of schools in Victoria that offer Hindi to all the students in the schools, and the numbers of those programs are growing. So it's very exciting for seeing this happening here. But there's another question right here.
My question is about, like any other language, Hindi has also been an evolutionary language. It's probably borrowed a lot of words from many other regions, for example, Persia, Sindhi, etc. And that's how a language probably evolves. But the thing is that if I were to draw a parallel with English has probably made it itself sustainable as a business by incorporating it and liberating it by having it on a typewriter. So any person can now write or script it. Whereas my question is, what has Hindi done to make itself more sustainable other than publishing houses and journalists having it? How are the children able to make it much more sustainable as a business, communication business?
Aditi, I wonder if you want to answer this from and briefly, because we're running short on time, but briefly from the perspective of translation and some of the work that you're doing.
So just a little detour, say 25 years on the flashback. My father was publishing a lot of shairi, and he was translating it from Urdu and Persian, and not translating, actually transliterating the scripts. And we have a file in the family, it's a sacred file which has the hate mails. So this file has all those obnoxious letters that he received in late 80s and early 90s for translating these works into Hindi. And all the purists were after his life saying that you're going to corrupt the language We don't need to learn from Urdu or Persian to enrich ourselves. But he kept on doing, and today I'm very proud to say that we have a very formidable list of shairi from all over the world. Over 400 shairs are published, and the recent one is John Elia Munir Niazi. So the idea is, you're absolutely correct that a language evolves when it learns from other languages. English evolved the same way. Chaucer's work actually was the beginning of formal English, and then it grew from there. We are doing a lot of translations. We have published into Hindi directly from over 19 to 20 global languages. The latest one being Latvian, which is just spoken by about 1.5 lakh people. So it's very difficult to find the translators, but it is a learning experience because it's like a linguistic gymnasium when you are translating from one language to another without the use of English in the meanwhile. So whether it's from Japanese to Hindi, from Chinese to Hindi, I've just signed up a contract last night for a Korean anthology of poetry, non-fiction, theatre, and one book on feminist biography of one of their leaders into Hindi directly from Korean. So we are now on a nationwide hunt of finding out more translators who could do that work. So you're absolutely correct. The way we have done it is because every language wants new material. The readers need to grow. If as a publishing house we stop thinking creatively about bringing in more genres, we are doing manga comics, we are doing Persepolis is going to be out very soon, and it's translated from French and not from English. So unless we do that, unless we keep feeding our readers with new stuff, we are going to be obsolete very soon. So that's one thing that is very clear, that new thing is the new thing.
I think I saw another hand, didn't I, somewhere? Yes, Dinesh, Dr. Dinesh Ji.
I just wanted to first make a comment and ask the question. Just to clarify a point, that generally the misconception that in India everybody speaks English. Okay, thank you. Some time ago, it used to be 2% of the population used to speak English. Now, the current statistics is about 11%. So you can, if you speak only English, you leave out a major portion of the Indian population. So that's a wrong thing. Second question was, I think, to Mrinal Pande ji, what happened? You were the editor of one of the most reputed magazines and newspaper in India. What happened there? What has changed? And I used also in the same context, I remember when we were growing up, there used to be several literary magazines. Now I don't know if there are any left.
Very few.
So, thank you.
Yeah. Do we have time?
We do have time for you to briefly
Very
say
briefly,
what
yeah.
happened, which I know it's a long
What
story.
happened was that money became scarce, and the owners changed. There was a generational change among the owners in mid-80s. Times of India, Samir Jain took over from his father. Hindustan Times, Shobna Bharatiya began to take over from her father, and Delhi Press, again Lalaji gave charge to his son. So there was a generational change. This generation had, unlike their fathers, been educated in English medium schools, and they had no great love for Hindi. So their departments of marketing and advertising solicited advertising for the English publications, but the Hindi publications were left to be financed by the government's Department of Audiovisual Publicity Advertisements, which pay a quarter of what commercial advertising agencies would pay you. So money became scarce, and at the same time, around the mid-80s, the price of paper shot up phenomenally. And then offset printing came in. When I started, we were still going the old style way, and there was no offset printing. Magazines were printed on copper cylinders and with movable fonts, and we saw exactly what blueprints used to be. But then midway through, offset printing became available. So the magazine that I was editing, for example, I insisted that we must have offset printing because Hindi readers deserved a clearly legible print. And after much arguments, they agreed. And we had to send a peon on a pedal bike to a very distant place to go and have the scripts fed into the offset sheets, bring back the galleys, then edit the galleys, and he would go back again on his pedal bike and get them proofread and be reset. Then these used to come back and be pasted by professional pasters and then sent to the press. So it was a long process and it involved a lot more money than the owners were then willing to. So all of a sudden, almost 10 of the best known Hindi magazines, which catered from news to films to entertainment to literature to sports to career counseling to women, they all were closed down because they said we cannot keep the cover price so low and take in losses year after year. Fact was their dailies were making a lot of money, but they were not willing to cross-subsidize. They said if we have to cross-subsidize, we'll cross-subsidize our English dailies. Our English dailies will cross-subsidize the English language magazines, not Hindi magazines. So all these magazines closed down, with which a whole era in literature came to an end. People like my mother who wrote serial novels like Charles Dickens, for which people queued up for the magazines. That whole era came to an end. And from 1990s onwards, then computers entered the scene. For 5 years, the unions resisted. Till 1995 in Hindustan Times House, the computers sat in the basement, but we were not permitted to use them because the unions felt that the pasters and the linotype setters and the page makers, they would all go redundant, which was true. So finally, they had to, fight the unions, break the unions back. It's the same story in every country, I guess.
I just have to add to it a bit. The thing with with Hindi journals and magazines is that ecosystem has become so rigid that we are not able to sell them. It is easier to sell them on Maxter today than to put them on the newsstands. We produce a magazine called Pratiman with a Center for the Studies of Developing Society, edited by Abhay Kumar Dubey. And this is Hindi's only peer-reviewed social sciences journal, solid social sciences journal. But I'm trying since last 2 years to put it on the newsstands, but they are not ready to keep it. You won't believe that every month we sell about 200 to 250 copies of it on Maxter, which is a US-based online journal portal.
Let me also clarify. Most sales of magazines in India are stall-based. They are not subscription-based.
No, they are not.
Unlike in the West, people don't subscribe for a whole year and have a system. So these are displayed in stalls. In fact, I remember one of the magazines which I helped launch in early 80s. I called it Vama, which means woman. And they said it's a very small name. When they lay it out on the stall, it will get hidden under magazines with longer names, like Saurabh Suman and Mahila Darpan, Greh Shobha, which have 5 or 6 letters on the masthead. So your masthead must have a longish name for the magazine. So those were the kind of. So it's a very different kind of a market which needs to be handled, studied with care, and then handled accordingly. It will sell, it can sell, but somebody somewhere has to invest in it.
I see that I can't believe the time is already up, but before I invite you to applaud our panel here, I just have a couple of thoughts about what we've heard. I'm just hearing there's a lot of tension here with Hindi. This language is burdened with some things that I think a lot of other languages don't necessarily have this type of burden, this bird that you're describing or whatever this is. And we've heard more than three very different stories. Kumudji, it's not that it was sort of a joyous story you had here, but it was something very exciting. It was very international. The Hindi you were describing was one not just of India and Australia, but you were describing many other countries and communities that contribute to this Australian story, and that was very exciting to hear. Aditi, you told us something from the perspective of you had a generational family perspective. You had a business and very, I think, practical perspective. You also talked about your own what you described as insecurities, but also a celebration of the language. So it was a different kind of tension. And then Mrinalji, of course, you told a story that was of both solace and sorrow, and everything in between. I mean, you took us on quite a journey. So I really, and just for me, since I'm coming into Hindi later in life. I didn't grow up in the language. I came to it starting when I was in university. So I'm sort of just finding my way in the world in Hindi and sort of discovering all these stories as I come along. So it's very eye-opening just for me as a scholar of the language. So I just want to thank our very distinguished panel. I want to thank you all for coming, and of course we can take the conversation out into the hallway, but just join me. Yeah.
Only 4 lines.
Yes, we'll end with these.
I especially got them for this conference because I knew we are talking about Hindi and we're going to have a very conflicted note to end it on. So just a very...
Yes, please.
Okay. Because मैं एक किताब वाली हूँ, तो it's दुकान किताब की महज एक दुकान नहीं, जमा है इसमें समंदर उफनते ख्यालों का। दुकान किताब की महज एक दुकान नहीं, जमा है इसमें समंदर उफनते ख्यालों का। दाद दीजिए।
क्या बात है, वाह।
किताबें बेचने वाली दुकानें खास होती हैं। यहाँ जज्बात मिलते हैं, ख्यालात मिलते हैं। यहाँ आदमी को इंसान बनाने के सारे समानात मिलते हैं।
क्या बात, क्या बात।
So on this note, thank you.
Thank you very much.